In this lesson, we're going to talk about drawing in painting, how it's different from drawing for drawing's sake. Drawing in painting is more geared towards simplifying shapes, setting up composition, and keeping things very simple so that color decisions become a lot easier. Because too much drawing destroys the idea of color and focuses more on detail. So understanding drawing as a simplification of what we're looking at is most important. Now today we're going to be talking about drawing and painting, and we're going to separate the idea of drawing from drawing for drawing's sake, where we're focused on outline and shade, to drawing and painting, which focuses on simplifying. So the purpose of drawing is, of course, to organize the large shapes, but it's also to simplify the shapes so that color becomes easier to decide. If my focus in drawing is detail or reproducing exactly what I see, I'm going to get caught up in all the stuff in here that isn't important, at least for me. All the variety of weeds, the figure back in here, all this stuff, even the little junk on the boat. Even if I put in some of that, in my drawing, I don't want to necessarily focus on that. I want to focus on large shapes. And the thumbnail drawing is a good example of the drawing we're after. We're after large shapes of dark and light. Because any detail or more broken color, which isn't drawing, but any things I want to add to the drawing or the painting later is still going to be simplified. Still going to keep it very simple. So the focus of the drawing and the painting is to create larger shapes, because it's easier to figure out color with larger shapes than it is a lot of smaller shapes and more simple values. So if I can draw this scene, which is a boat in Greece, if I can see it like this in my drawing and get this down on the canvas, then that's going to help a lot. Plus I've cropped it a little bit, zoomed in. Also zooming in on the subject to get rid of what's not important. So my drawing becomes light and shadow oriented and shape oriented, not detail oriented. Now I can use some outline, but that's usually after I establish big abstract masses, like the shadow on the boat here that becomes the shadow on the rock and the shadow on the trees. It becomes larger, more easier shapes to draw than seeing this. This becomes more complicated because I'm starting to see more detail. So the drawing helps establish what you're going to paint in more simple terms. And that's always done better with shape than it is with outline. So again, I'll use some outline in the drawing, but not much. I'm going to stay with the idea of shape over outline. And any detail will be added later. So I'm going to be doing most of the drawing before I add color. In other words, I want to have the drawing set before I start adding color. And again, that's big, simple shapes. Now there are some details I'm interested in. The handles here I like, the ropes, maybe a little bit of the discoloration on the boat, some of the weeds, not all of them, maybe the fishing nets and the tarp on top of the fishing nets back there. So it kind of goes along with this tarp and fishing nets. Those are things that I'm interested in as far as detail goes, but I'm going to add those right on top of thick paint. So I'm doing most of the drawing, the big, simpler shapes, before I add color. But once I add color, I'm still going to add some drawing. I'm still going to be doing some drawing of some smaller shapes, some detail. But again, most of it is set before I add any paint. Most of my drawing will already be figured out. So this is my drawing. That's how I want to see it, because this is a lot easier to draw than that. I've massed things together. I've gotten rid of a lot of detail, especially in the shadows. That's going to be easier to draw. And if I don't do anything back in here, just have that shape, and just have these shapes in here, it's still going to work, because painting is not about detail. It's about suggesting light and simplifying shapes. Same thing here. After cropping it, zooming in a bit, deciding what's going to be important. I want a bit more ground than sky, because I see the sky as being, or the ground being more interesting. So I didn't quite do that here, but in the drawing or the painting, I would want the horizon line to be a little higher than halfway. because I want more foreground, less sky. So I'd probably extend the foreground down a little bit. It's a little bit half and half. Half sky, half foreground. So I don't want that horizon line in the middle. But then the simplification comes from ignoring, especially in the beginning, like the wood grain and the variety of colors and values within the wood grain of the barn. So you kind of decide, your focus is going to be capturing the light, which means simplifying detail, simplifying shapes. Makes it a lot easier as far as the thinking goes, if you can kind of work through that in your head first. So when I look at something like this, I automatically ignore the wood grain. Same thing with the fence posts. I like the fence rails in here. I think they add a lot to it, but I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to pull that together in some areas and create just a larger dark shape and just suggest a little bit of detail in it. So that my focus here is going to be more like that. So I'm thinking more about those shapes. And again, what I'm going to eliminate. I want to eliminate some of the barn. So I don't want to get the whole barn in there. It pulls you back too far. But if I let some of the barn run off the right side of the page, some of the fence run off the left, it makes it feel like there's space outside of the picture plane. But if I squeeze everything into the picture plane, everything looks kind of squished, kind of sardine-like. But I can draw this a lot better than that. Again, the detail pops out. Now, some of that detail I want, but we need to get in the habit of seeing that that's the important drawing first. And then, of course, proportions. We want to talk about making the right proportions, how big the tree is to the barn, how big the foreground is compared to the barn, and how big this barn is compared to the sky and the foreground. So everything kind of relates shape-wise, size-wise, and value-wise. And in the drawing, I want to reduce the values to just two, the dark and the light. Because it's so much easier to deal with composition, setting up values, if I just simplify everything. And then color becomes a lot easier too. But if I get too much detail in my drawing, color becomes impossible. A couple more here. This has a lot of detail in it. And again, a lot of the detail I like. I like a lot of, this stuff. I like those things, that, this, the doorway here, this rope with the things hanging on it. I'm not a boat person. All that detail I think is necessary to add the character to the boat. But in the drawing, I have to do away with it. There's just no place for it. I want to see the drawing more like this than that. Really simplified. The darks just become a pattern, just a shape. Again, we're drawing this with very thin, transparent paint. We're not using opaque paint or any white. It's just transparent. And I'm reducing this one to two darks, the darker dark and the lighter dark of the water. And then the canvas can just be anything that's in the sunlight. But that makes the drawing a lot easier. And this makes it a lot easier to come up with color, because I'm just coming up with a color for shadow, a color for sunlight, maybe two values in the sunlight, another color for the blue. But I've really simplified it to come up with easier ideas of what's going on color-wise. More detail, broken up shapes, simpler shapes, more contrasting values. It's easier to set up real strong value contrasts. The photograph has a lot of light in the shadow. Shadows are a lot lighter, which I can do to some degree, but I want to start it like this, and then I can lighten the shadow as much as I think I need to. Or leave it a little darker, create more contrast, because we're not tied to the photograph. One more here. This is in Colorado. And again, zooming in first to eliminate what's not necessary. And again, I want more foreground here than sky. Look a bit more of a square shape here. Have the horizon line a bit higher than the middle. I don't want the horizon line dead center. So as long as I have it, center's about here. So I'm lifting my horizon line up to here. So cropped a lot of the sky to have more of the foreground. Plus the foreground just kind of leads you into the focal point. And of course, a lot of composition is what you do with the camera before you even start painting or drawing at all. Finding something that's composable, that makes sense compositionally, which also helps. If I can understand drawing better, I'm going to take better photographs because I'm looking for larger shapes that set up a composition, at least something that I can turn into a composition, because not everything's perfect in a photograph. But here I can go ahead and find that shadow pattern, and I can even make a little more of a slightly more detailed shadow pattern, just more varied. in the shape, but I want to pull it together into bigger, simpler shapes. There's some detail there that I like, kind of important, but eliminating everything drawing-wise to just these dark shapes. A lot easier than this because we can get so caught up in, this stuff, the door, this plastic on the door as opposed to the wood, windows. I am interested in the window here and the door and some of this stuff in here, but not in the drawing stage. In the drawing, I just want a simple dark and light because that's going to make color and simplifying values so much easier. By the time you're ready to start color, your drawing should be done. And then as you paint, you're still going to be drawing to some degree because you're going to be adding things to it, but the main focus of the drawing will be done even before you add color.